EU leaders agree to spend more on defence. Are they simply meeting their commitments towards NATO? Or do they fear a broader change in US policy towards Europe in the Trump era? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. All but 6 of the European Union's 28 members are also members of NATO. So while the two organisations are separate, there is a lot of overlap. And when the EU says it wants to step up both defence spending and coordinated military action, well, that's a move that obviously affects NATO too. That's why Thursday's commitment by EU members to raise their military spending to 2% of GDP is potentially significant. The announcement came at the end of an EU summit in Brussels, where the fighting in Aleppo and concerns over Brexit dominated the headlines. But though it attracted less attention, the move could have far-ranging consequences. In this, as in so much else in Europe these days, Germany's Angela Merkel took the lead. Our Dominic Kane has more from Berlin.
The issue of how much money individual EU countries spend from their GDP on defence has been a bugbear issue, certainly for the American government, which has continually perhaps chastised its NATO allies, its European partners, about the money they spend on defence. So this development of a greater commitment to intensify the amount of spending will be welcomed by the White House and perhaps also by the incoming administration of Donald Trump, which had made greater defence spending by NATO allies a key priority. And although in recent weeks, in recent months, the German government had seemed perhaps a little bit reluctant to go as far as was required, now that's changed, something that Angela Merkel intimated in Brussels.
Another important pillar of our council will be internal and external security. Here the cooperation is also particularly in matters of defence. I hope we've taken a step here because I believe it is clear that the European Union must not be against NATO, but together in NATO, and with NATO, still the defence structures have to tighten.
The watchword here at Germany's Defence Ministry is cooperation. They are stressing the importance of NATO, something that Angela Merkel has talked about, something that Defence Minister Ursula von der Leyen has talked about at a European level, stressing the cooperation between NATO but also between the European Union. But the devil there may be in the detail, because while there are those at the European Commission and in the EU who say that there has to be a greater possibility for military response by the EU, the United Kingdom is adamantly opposed to a European army. So if the Europeans are serious about getting serious militarily, there may be real problems ahead.
Well, NATO is based on the concept of collective security, diverse countries working together and committing to defend each other if any of them are attacked. Well, the alliance was founded in 1949 and now has 28 members. At a summit in 2006, it agreed that every member should spend at least 2% of its GDP on defence. But only 5 NATO countries actually meet this requirement. Of those, only the US spends significantly more than the guideline. The other 4 just barely clear it. Well, at the other end of these 5 countries don't even spend 1% of GDP on defence, meaning they're putting up less than half of what they've promised. Bring our guests into the show now. We have in London Alex Kokcharov. He's the lead Russia analyst at IHS Market Country Risk. In Tallinn, Estonia, Marko Mihkelson, an Estonian member of parliament and head of the Estonian delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And in Washington, D.C., Mark Jacobson, a former advisor to Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. Good to have you with us. If I could start with Alex. Is this Europe simply stepping up to what it owes, what it should be paying towards NATO? Or is there a bigger picture here of European leaders worried they might be left kind of more alone to face a resurgent Russia?
In my view, Europe is clearly reacting to the developments of the past couple of years, generally in the European security arena, but also to the latest developments in the US with the change of the administration. First and foremost, Russia has been militarily and foreign policy assertive in Europe, particularly in Ukraine, but also it has shown significant degree of assertiveness towards its westerly neighbors, whether in the NATO or outside of it, neutral countries such as Sweden or Finland. We have seen a larger number of Russian military exercises, most of which are snap exercises, and they are being held very close to the borders of Russian neighbors, whether the Baltic states, Poland or Finland. We have seen a number of marine and naval incidents in the Baltic Sea and in the Black Sea. And clearly, Europe has been watching what's been happening in Ukraine in the past couple of years, with Russia taking very active participation, first in Crimea and then in the east of the country. Right. And also we have seen the change of the US administration and the new incoming administration demanding the NATO allies to spend more on defense.
All right, that's a good point now to transition to Washington, D.C. Mark Jacobson, how far do you think the Trump administration envisages going in resetting relations with Russia?
Thank you, Sami. Look, I have great concern that the Trump administration is going to be too soft on the Russians. We heard the rhetoric during the campaign. We've seen the concern from our European allies. But I think there's a little bit of good news. First, the issue over defense spending has been one that the Obama administration raised over and over again. As the report pointed out, this has been an issue since the 2006 commitments. So I think it's a great step that we're finally seeing at least a commitment. Now we need to see the obligation of the funds to get over that 2% level. I think that will temper the Trump administration. There are some who argue that Trump's position was merely a negotiating tactic. I do hope that's the case. I think there'll be a real fight internally in the U.S. government, both between a prospective Trump administration or within a prospective Trump administration, but also with the U.S. Congress. I don't see Senators McCain or Graham allowing the administration not to take a hard line on Russia. I don't see the administration in a position to renege on commitments to NATO. But we're going to have to watch, because I think the signals that Trump sends to Moscow in the first few months of the administration and potentially at a NATO summit in 2017 are really going to set the stage for the next 4 years.
And he is a bit of a maverick, isn't he? Let's just remind ourselves of the sorts of things we're talking about that Trump said during that campaign trail. The increase in NATO spending comes just weeks before the US President-elect Donald Trump takes office, and for months he's been pushing for NATO countries, as our contributors just said, to put in more money towards that defense spending. Here he is speaking in September.
I haven't given lots of thought to NATO, but two things. Number one, the 28 countries of NATO, many of them aren't paying their fair share. Number two, and that bothers me because we should be, yes, we're defending them and they should at least be paying us what they're supposed to be paying by treaty and contract.
Now, in a separate interview with the New York Times, you might recall, Trump was asked directly if the Baltic republics, which are NATO members, of course, could count on US support if they were attacked by Russia. His answer, quote, have they fulfilled their obligations to us? If they fulfill their obligations to us, then the answer is yes. Marko, in Tallinn, when you hear stuff like that, do you think European leaders, are you in Estonia worried about whether you can count on US support in the same way as perhaps you did in the past?
You know, looking from Estonia, we don't see any doubts in terms of keeping Western transatlantic alliance strongly together. In Estonia, next year's budget on defense running at the level of 2.2% of GDP, and the same level actually is agreed politically in Lithuania and Latvia to reach by 2018. Poland is already reaching this 2% level. So as you see, the belt here on the eastern flank of NATO is strongly committed to the 2% of GDP for defense. What is positive actually from campaign of U.S. presidential election is that probably these statements by Mr. Trump has been awakening calls for many leaders here in Europe. And for many years, actually, the talk is up and topic is up about spending more to defense. And we all know that the time to take out peace dividends is over. Just we have so many challenges around our borders. And that's something what is very positive, echoed yesterday during Prime Minister's meeting in Brussels.
But Marko, if I could put the question this way, I mean, while some countries, your country and other countries in Eastern Europe might be paying their dues when it comes to the guidelines, the 2006 Riga guidelines for contributions to NATO, many other countries are not. Does that worry you? Because if there is a scenario where the US does not come to intervene in the sort of way that a NATO ally expects anywhere in Europe, that undermines the collective action of the whole group, doesn't it?
For sure, that if the United States are paying today something like 70–75% of total defense expenditures of NATO countries, it's not going to be sustainable for a long time. But Estonia made this decision already in year 2011 to reach out to the level of 2% GDP. Plus, commitments what we have in terms of participating in international missions like in Iraq or Afghanistan or Lebanon for UNIFIL at the moment. This comes actually for very deep understanding here in Estonia, which is sitting within society. We know what it means to be not a free nation, and we all know how difficult it was to regain independence 25 years ago. And this is something what makes politically very strong and consensus-based understanding that we have to put money into defense on our own, plus also as a small country we have extremely important to work together with allies and partners, both within NATO and EU.
Okay, Alex, I guess we could say there are some broad trajectories going on right now. NATO militarizing its assets or beefing up its assets in Eastern Europe along the border with Russia. I think we had the first US tanks arriving back in Europe just a day or two ago, since the last US tanks were pulled out just a few years. Do you think any of those sorts of trajectories could be changed by the ascent of Trump to the White House?
Possibly, yes, but I think it's still very early days. And as Mark in Washington mentioned, we don't have the full picture as of yet. The key individuals who will be driving foreign and military policy in the United States in the next 4 years have not been appointed as of yet. We also know that the Congress may be taking a different position compared to the administration. For instance, in early December, Congress approved military aid to Ukraine, reaffirming its commitment, US commitment to supporting the current government in Kiev. So the picture is likely to be complicated, and it is a bit too early to say what the clear policy of this new administration will be. And
all right,
we are definitely watching for indicators here.
Okay, that aspect not very clear. Mark Jacobson in Washington, D.C. Is it clear, at least at this point, that the US and Europe are on different paths when it comes to sanctions on Russia? We've had EU leaders agreeing to extend sanctions. Some leaders were even pushing for a longer extension. The leaders of France and Germany were pushing for even new sanctions on Russia. All of this as Donald Trump talks about improving relations with Russia.
Look, I'm heartened by a few things. I'm heartened that it's the Europeans taking the lead on sanctions. I'm heartened that it's the Europeans, as suggested, reacting a bit to Trump and, of course, to Brexit as well, saying, look, we can't wait around anymore. We have to increase the defense spending. The point that Trump made during the campaign that I think is most important is, quote, I haven't thought about this much. And I think that's you can't overstate the importance of that point. As he begins to get more involved and starting to understand the economic, the security, the relationships across the Atlantic a bit better, I think he'll start to understand that how the transatlantic relationship works to counter challenges, whether it's extremism in the Middle East, whether it's a revanchist Russia, are incredibly important in terms of how they work together. And I think this means that despite his attempts to try and warm to the Russians, he's going to understand that it's in the U.S. interest to keep that transatlantic bond with members who share our values, that is going to be more important. And I think that once he starts to understand the economic impact that both sanctions can have as a tool to push the Russians into a better state, or understand the importance of some of these trade relationships. And it may not be his own understanding. It may be those in his cabinet who start to have a greater impact on him. I just think we're going to see a tempering. I am not as concerned. However, I am more concerned, and perhaps we'll get to this in a bit, about this interplay between the EU and NATO. And I think this is actually where we need to be watching, because there are some dangers here.
We do want to raise
splitting our efforts.
I do want to raise that in a second, but before we do that, let me briefly go back to Alex in London and ask the question. Now that the EU leaders are talking about increasing defence spending, are there any guidelines to say what constitutes defence?
Not to my understanding, and again, because the national budgets are planned and laid out in various ways.
Okay,
in
if that's the case, then Alex, does an increase in defence spending necessarily mean the extra money is going to go towards NATO plans and operations, i.e., meet that expectation in the 2006 Riga guideline?
Again, it's very difficult to say, because it very much depends on the national legislation and the way the national budgets are formulated. And in some countries there is clearer guidance, and in some countries it's not the case.
So let me take the question to... Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Mark Jacobson.
This is a really important point. I think that we have this expectation that when we see European defense budgets raised, that it necessarily has to go to buying tanks, ships, planes. But the threat out there includes things such as cyber. The threat out there is, especially in the Baltics, is there's a need to increase the resilience of society if we are to defend against the little green men and the information warfare that Russia is waging. And those expenditures are more likely to be seen in domestic budget lines than they are in traditional national security budget lines. And I take Alex's point. This will be state-driven, but I think there can be increased public support for some of these expenditures if you're talking about increasing resiliency, looking at national police force cooperation, looking at ways to battle corruption. So I think there's something that we haven't looked at traditionally in terms of NATO and European defense spending that could be a great advantage, both in terms of the Russian threat and in terms of gaining political support for increased budgets.
All right, let me take a question now to Tallinn, to Mark in Tallinn, I should say. We're already seeing both, you could say, I guess, Brexit and the comments by Donald Trump pushing European Union states, it seems, towards a more sort of common defense policy, right? Is that the way you read things?
Look, Europe talks about common defense policy already from late 90s. There's nothing new here in EU. But let me come back to the point Mark made.
Sorry, Marko, wasn't it new when we saw, for example, on November 30th, the EU Commission proposing for the first time, let's have a €5 billion common defence fund. Let's allow the EU common budget to invest in military research. I mean, that's not just talk, is it? That does sound
because,
like...
but you know, European Union has a number of civil military operations going on right now, and I think this is pretty fair actually to see how commonly we could spend money better. You know, we have a pretty interesting experience, let's say mildly, the battle groups, what has been trained, put together already for years, but we never politically were ready to send them to solve some crises on our borders. But I come back to Mark's point. I'm not worried about that EU is going to be create some parallel structures or duplicate the NATO structures. Yesterday, actually, High Representative Mogherini was very clear presenting her views to prime ministers in Brussels, saying strongly that no, we don't need, we are not going to duplicate what NATO has already, because it's going to be silly, because most of the EU countries, member countries, are at the same time NATO member countries. But what is really good point, what was made also earlier, that we have to see much further than just the 2% and just the defense, because in Estonia we have witnessed and experienced the cyber attacks already 10 years ago, and established NATO's Center of Excellence for Cyber Defense. And the question of, for instance, in today's world, the fake news, how to make your society resilient. I don't think that this is a problem here in Estonia or in the Baltic states, but look what happened during the US campaign. 200 plus more fake portals to telling stories what never happened. Right. This is something what is really important also to see parallel to the spending 2% of GDP for defense.
All right, let me bring Mark Jacobson in on this from Washington, D.C. So to pick up on Marko's point there, is it really bad news, a common EU defense or more common EU defense policy, necessarily bad news for NATO?
If the EU goes along the lines that Marko suggested, avoiding parallel structures, especially operationally, I think this is good news. I'm not only a transatlanticist, I'm a big believer in EU-NATO cooperation and in dual-hatting organizations. So in other words, an organization, whether it's a battle group or a command element, might be working for NATO in one mission, but might be working as an EU organization in another. This requires some very careful structural planning. Now, if there is a move afoot to create a parallel structure that, for example, does not include UK or, very importantly, Turkish forces, US forces, Canadian forces, I think we run the risk of hampering NATO when we need it. I still think there needs to be much more emphasis politically on rebuilding NATO and increasing that political cooperation, because again, that is the organization that will not only bind Europe, but also bind North America to the continent, to the UK and to Turkey, which is really the key to counter threats.
All right, let me distill a question from a couple of ideas that have come to mind listening to what our guests are saying, and take them to Alex now. If an increase in European defense spending can go towards perhaps joint EU projects as well, not necessarily exclusively NATO, and if it's a little bit vague, as I think we agreed a second ago about what we consider to be defense spending, it might not necessarily go towards NATO operations. I mean, who knows? Maybe a European country might decide that building a wall to defend itself against, or as it sees, against refugees coming from Syria might be defense. If that's the reality, are we making a mistake in assuming that an increase in European defense spending necessarily means Europe is meeting its commitments to NATO, and therefore any problems with the US are going to be resolved just by increasing defense spending, and NATO will go on business as usual?
Well, I think it's important to understand that, the old-fashioned understanding of defense as creating protection from state actors is long gone. A lot of states across the world deal with a number of non-state actors, such as the Islamic State and various extremist and terrorist organizations, but also they have their other security challenges, which broadly fall under the defense obligations. And as you rightly mentioned, is the European states' efforts in managing migration from outside of the EU, such as dealing with large-scale inflows of refugees, are part of defense mechanism? And this is a new reality we're dealing with. If you look at Ukraine, for instance, in 2014, the threat was hybrid. And I think in the future, we are going to see more hybrid threats, which are not necessarily, which can be linked to state actors, but not necessarily, not necessarily overtly part of state actors.
All right, I'm afraid we are out of time, so I apologize. We're going to have to thank our guests. Thanks very much, Alex Kokcharov in London, Marko Mihkelson in Tallinn, and from Washington, D.C., Mark Jacobson. And thank you too for watching. As always, you can see the show again anytime if you head over to our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can also go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter too. Our handle there, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here for now is goodbye.